fighting started.
More shots fired.
The horrific picture just moments after the white van...
Multiple fatalities is what we're hearing from officials.
Kim Jong-un detonated what is widely believed to have been a hydrogen bomb.
The world has devolved into a place where nobody can feel safe.
Wars is everywhere, it's every corner of the world.
At least 40 people were killed, hundreds were...
Every day when you're on the news, there's more and more violence.
Tear gas. There has been pepper spray.
I'm afraid for my children and the world that they'll grow up in.
They let loose a hail of bullets.
It keeps getting worse.
And this time, gunfire aimed at elementary school children.
This is the 22nd school shooting
There's gun violence, police brutality, people coming and attacking our country.
First of the two explosions.
That could happen to my city. That could happen to me.
The world is through and through a violent place. That's just a part of existence.
Is this who we are? A species doomed to kill and be killed. A never-ending cycle of violence.
The reality is that we may be living in one of the most peaceful eras in human existence.
Peaceful? Could this possibly be true?
Violence has been in decline, but that just doesn't count as news. You just never see a journalist saying, "I'm reporting live from a country that's at peace," or a school that hasn't been shot up.
Psychologist Steven Pinker was reading an obscure text when he came across a chart that piqued his interest. It plotted a steep decline in rates of homicide in England.
Once I stumbled upon this graph, I mentioned it in a blog post, and then I received correspondence from scholars in a variety of fields telling me that I could have made an even stronger case.
Intrigued, he looked further.
I saw dataset after dataset, all of which showed declines in violence in different parts of the world with different kinds of violence. And I realized there was a story that needed to be told.
A story that spans the entirety of human history, drawing on disciplines from archaeology to neuroscience, and has the potential to turn conventional wisdom on its head.
To me, it's absolutely huge. If we think that life is better by going back into the past, we're making a very serious mistake.
The greatest thing that's happened to humanity is that we've lowered our rates of violent death by 90%. This is the big story.
But could it be too good to be true?
The demographics of the past are not at all clear-cut. And so as a result, we're making comparisons that we're drawing literally out of thin air.
There's so many people who would hear Steven Pinker and think, what world is he living in? This isn't my life at all.
It depends on who you are and where you live.
North Korea's nuclear test among the 27.
Steve's overarching claim flies in the face of common sense. That can't be true. The Cossacks are always coming. There's always danger.
We may or may not agree with his conclusions, but it is important to understand the trends of violence so we can prevent, if possible, violence today.
It's a controversial argument, but if physical violence really has declined, it presents us with a huge opportunity.
To point out that things were worse in the past is not to say we should relax, our problems are all solved. Quite the contrary, it's by understanding how our predecessors were able to drive down rates of violence that we can be emboldened to try to drive them down even further.
Has violence declined? And if so, can we uncover clues in our past to make us safer today? To find out, we have to go back, way back, to some of the earliest records of human prehistory. In one of the most desolate places on Earth.
Taruk is the bleak part of the landscape. There's no vegetation, and it's got a dark gravel covering the surface.
Marta Mirazon-Lar started excavating this site 7 years ago.
We arrived, and already you could see on the floor all these fragments of bones.
The first thing we saw was in this area that we could see coming out of the ground the broken lower legs, the shin bones of somebody. We started clearing and excavating, and the bones of another one appeared. So we would clean that one, and the bones of another one appeared.
We found the remains of 27 people.
They're not graves that have been dug or prepared. They are in positions that suggest that they just lied where they died. What we have here is actually an ancient crime scene.
A crime that took place 10,000 years ago, when this desert looked very different.
10,000 years ago, you had a very large lake that had formed a beach.
We would have had palm trees and gazelles and hippopotamus. It would have been a really rich landscape.
So what we had was a population of fisher foragers, hunter-gatherers. And whenever there is something that one group has and another one doesn't, the potential for conflict exists.
A conflict recounted in bones, now buried in a remote storeroom in northern Kenya.
You read them like a book, and the skeletons are telling us a bit about their life, but most about their death.
When we found this skull, all we could see was the back of the head. But when we started excavating, we could see the whole skeleton, lying face down. And when you turn it around, you can see this bone has been crushed in. He received a blow with a blunt instrument and another one on the side of the head.
And he wasn't alone. Many of the skeletons bore signs of violence.
There are injuries to the head that suggest there's a cut in the face of the skull. Injuries to the spine that suggest projectiles, arrows. And this one was bound at the time of death. Inside the ribs, we found the bones of a baby.
Something terrible clearly happened here. But what?
One of the most striking discoveries at Taruk comes from what was probably the most difficult skeleton to excavate. However, we discovered the tip of an arrow still embedded in the head. We have direct evidence that people were attacked. But there's more. The arrow tip was made of obsidian, a material that is rare and of which we find no sources locally, and so on. It tells me that the attackers actually came from somewhere else. It wasn't just a chance encounter between two groups fishing that ended up in a fight. Because if you go out fishing, you're not carrying this range of weapons.
The bones of Nataruk are the oldest known evidence of a planned raid, a form of early warfare.
And I think that as a behavior, as a characteristic of human societies, it probably goes back in time much, much deeper.
The question is, how deep?
The archaeological record on every continent shows massive evidence of human-to-human destruction. You know, there's just no other way of putting it, right? The Paleolithic record is a horror show.
From Utsi, the 5,000-year-old Iceman found with an arrow in his back.
It looks like a hit job.
To Kennewick Man, 8,500 years old. A blow to the chest, shattering 6 ribs. To Cima de los Huesos, Spanish for pit of the bones, where a 430,000-year-old Neanderthal was found with severe blunt force trauma.
Head bashed in, indubitably. There's even evidence of cannibalism on almost every continent. You see violence time and time again in archaeological site after archaeological site.
Of course, a handful of cases may not be a fair sample of the distant past. How violent were we?
You can't answer that question by particular incidents because there's violence in all societies. You really do have to count.
And that's exactly what a group of Spanish scientists did. Scouring the records of over 600 human populations between 50,000 years ago and today. Surveying the evidence, a bashed-in skull here, an embedded arrowhead there, they found that the proportion of prehistoric people who suffered a violent death was up to 3 times greater than today.
I was stunned at the high rates of violence. There's nothing close in any modern society.
What has changed? And more importantly, why? To figure that out, you first need to understand some pretty basic things about us.
People often ask, are humans violent by nature or peaceable by nature? The reality is we're both.
Pinker views our history as an epic struggle between our inner demons that push us toward violence and our angels that pull us away.
The brain is a complex place. It houses many circuits, some of which incline us toward violence and some of which inhibit us from violence.
That tension between acting on an aggressive impulse and restraining ourselves is fundamental in our brains because we are clearly aggressive animals.
From body-slamming seals to fighting fruit flies, violence, usually committed by males, is something we share with most animals on the planet.
Aggression is one of the most common social behaviors across the animal kingdom. Almost every sexually reproducing species shows aggression, including us.
What in our brains drives aggression? That's what scientists at Caltech are trying to figure out. These mice have been genetically manipulated so that certain neurons in the brain can be activated by this blue laser.
There are groups of neurons that if you activate these neurons in a mouse, you can trigger aggression.
In the lab, Tomomi Karigo hooks up a mouse to the laser. Now, at the push of a button, she can remotely control the mouse's behavior.
By stimulating the certain brain region, we can change the emotional state of the mouse, just flipping the switch. This animal is now in an aggressive state, attacking the other mouse.
there's some component of like a volume control knob here, where as we stimulate them more intensely, we get more intense aggression.
Look what happens when you turn the power down.
Now light is off, and the animal retreat to the corner of the cage.
Not only are we able to turn on aggression at will, we can also stop a fight dead in its tracks by inactivating these neurons.
This experiment in mouse mind control has allowed them to pinpoint aggression in the brain.
We've learned that there are clusters of cells deep in the brain in a region called the hypothalamus that play a key role in organizing aggressive behavior.
The same may be true with us. Turns out, whether it is mice or humans, we share some of the same basic wiring.
The parts of the brain that are in the mouse that control these behaviors are present in humans. They are some of the most evolutionarily ancient parts of the brain.
So the wiring for aggression runs deep. But that's only half the story.
We have circuits in our brain that incline us toward rage, toward revenge, toward sadism. On the other hand, there are other circuits in the brain that give us a sense of empathy, an ability to feel the pain of others. Even babies have a rudimentary sense of fairness.
So I think we're ready for Ethan. Would you like to bring him into our testing room?
Karen Wynn is a developmental psychologist at Yale who has created an ingenious experiment to find out whether babies are born with a sense of morality.
I'm going to just have you sit here.
I was interested in the fundamental structures of the human mind. What do we bring with us when we come into the world? How do we understand the world?
Up goes the curtain.
To figure that out, she puts on a 2-act puppet show for babies.
So this duck is looking inside this box, sees a nice toy inside of it, and is trying to open the box to get the toy, but is not being successful opening it. And this green-shirted puppy very nicely helps the duck so it can get its toy. That's our nice puppet.
In Act 2, this nice puppy takes center stage.
And now our nice puppy is playing with this ball, and he very nicely rolls it over to the blue-shirted puppet. And the blue-shirted puppet rolls it nicely back to him. That was a nice interaction. And this time he's going to invite the other kitty to play with him. Will you roll it back to me? No, he steals the ball. What a jerk.
Hi.
Next, the babies are given a choice.
Which one do you like?
Do they prefer the kitty who was nice to the nice puppy or mean to the nice puppy?
If you give them the choice, babies very robustly choose the nice one.
Awesome job.
Even a 3-month-old can look at an interaction between two strangers and decide, oh, that's a good interaction. That's a nice human being. Or, that was a bad interaction. That's a jerk. I don't like that jerk.
Do you want to just show Dad where to sit?
But that's just the half of it. Watch what happens when Wynn flips the script and babies see a mean version of the same play.
Up goes the curtain.
This time, this mean puppy comes along and slams the box lid shut. He's not nice at all.
This time, the mean puppy is the star of Act 2. Just like his nice counterpart, he gets treated nicely by the blue kitty, and then meanly by the orange kitty.
Do you see these?
Will the babies still prefer the nice kitty?
Do you see this one? Which one do you like?
No. Now they consistently pick the mean one.
Which one do you like?
Turns out that even at this age, babies have the capacity to make simple moral judgments.
Oh, good job.
It's like, you're not deserving of having a friend play a nice game with you. You treated someone else badly, you should be treated badly in your turn. So that tells us that well before their first birthday, babies are already developing notions of just desserts. That is morality.
So both angels and demons are baked into our biology.
We have both of these behavioral strategies in our nature, instilled in us through the process of evolution, and we switch between them according to what we judge as more effective.
If violence has declined since prehistoric times, what did our ancestors do that tipped the balance toward our better angels?
One of the first violence reduction techniques was the state. Government can tamp down the cycles of violence.
The human species has come a long way for thousands of years to get where we are today. Because of government, we stay in line.
Until about 5,000 years ago, humans lived in small, nomadic bands. But as agriculture took hold, populations grew, and the first governments emerged.
As societies get bigger and bigger, more and more problems have to be solved, and the sort of almost inevitable result of this is people start to form governments.
Governments that would need more complex systems of rules and leaders to solve those problems. While those early kings and pharaohs waged plenty of wars, they had a strong incentive to reduce violence among their minions.
It's not that the early kings and emperors had a benevolent interest in the welfare of their citizens, but just as a farmer has an incentive to prevent his cattle from killing each other, these early rulers wanted to prevent violence that deprived them of slaves and soldiers and taxpayers.
Much of the decline of violence is due to the existence of the state. Without government, the potential for chaos is huge.
In fact, when researchers pooled together the work of anthropologists, ethnographers, and statisticians, comparing those living in a state society to those who do not, the numbers are striking.
Whenever there are data that actually count the bodies, you see that rates of violence in non-state societies are higher than in societies with the rule of law.
Even so, for those living under the world's first governments, life was still pretty brutal.
In general, rates of violence go down. But when people are pacified by a kingdom or an emperor, it's not that they're free of violence, because the violence of people killing each other is replaced by the violence of the state killing people.
Through pretty much the whole of history, one of the things you do if you're the ruler of a society is advertise just how violent you're going to be if somebody crosses you.
From the Maya, who sacrificed to appease the gods, to the Romans, who killed for spectacle, to Han Dynasty China, where torture was legal. And if you think early religions were a paradigm of peace, think again.
The Bible, the so-called Good Book, is one long cavalcade of violence, beginning with Cain slaying Abel, Noah's flood. You have Samson killing thousands with the jawbone of an ass. And then the Israelites are commanded by God to commit total genocide.
It would appear that our ancestors were obsessed with violence.
Sir, enemy fighters coming in.
And judging from our taste in entertainment today,
Stop
battle will be legendary.
So are we. Even the mild-mannered among us can have a taste for violence, especially when it comes to revenge. A pleasure we can witness in the brain.
We're gonna have you do the competitive reaction time task, okay?
Yeah.
Here we go.
Here at the University of Kentucky, David Chester scans the brain of a volunteer as they play a simple game. Who can press a button faster when a red square appears on the screen? The winner gets to blast their opponent with an annoying sound at a volume of their choice.
Remember that 1 and 2 are pretty quiet, and 3 and 4 get pretty loud.
The subject thinks they are playing against a real opponent, but actually it's a computer, and it's not going to play nice.
She just saw that her opponent picked a 4, so now she's been thoroughly provoked.
The volunteer seeks revenge.
She just picked a 4. Seems as though she's a little upset.
Now Chester can peer inside the brain at the very moment of retaliation. The scanner reveals increased activity in the ventral striatum, part of the brain's so-called pleasure center.
The circuits in the brain that light up are the same as the ones that light up when we crave chocolate or gamble or see an attractive person. So the old saying, revenge is sweet, is literally true.
On this level, it seems our impulses haven't changed much. But have we always acted on them? What do the numbers say? As humanity moves toward the Middle Ages, the investigation turns from archaeology to written records.
Most human societies historically have not been in the business of creating vast amounts of writing. The societies of the West are rather unusual in the amount of documents that they created and then successfully preserved.
The decline of violence is by no means a Western phenomenon, although until recently, a lot of the studies focused on the West because that's where the data were.
And some of the strongest data was assembled by Manuel Eisner, a historical criminologist with a singular obsession: murder.
Over the years, I developed a little bit of an obsessive interest in trying to find all the publications in different languages that had been written on homicide. Robert of Chinham hit Amice, daughter of Alistair Crotchall, on the head with a stick so that she died, and he fled at once. Evildoers came to Thomas of Inglefield's house and killed him, and banned Geoffrey and sa femme le matin, à la suite d'une altercation this morning to my wife, and then he kills her.
It all started when he read an article that claimed that since the Middle Ages, homicide rates in England declined 40-fold.
I thought, this can't be true. And so I started looking at more evidence, more data.
Trouble was, the data didn't exist in any one place.
Eisner had to go deep into archives, sometimes into the basements of old town halls and churches, brush off the mouse droppings, and tally the causes of death.
I would be looking at court records, prison documents, account books, confessions, or pardon books.
Each source added a data point. Over the course of a decade, Eisner was able to plot homicide rates for England, Italy, Scandinavia, the Netherlands and Belgium, Germany and Switzerland. In the process, an astonishing picture began to emerge.
All these dots that I'd collected lined up over 800 years along one single line. That was kind of like just an amazing moment. For every 100 years, the homicide rate in Europe was cut in half.
When Manuel Eisner showed that this decline had happened in pretty much every European country for which we had continuous data, I realized this is a real phenomenon. It is not just the history of one country, but it seems to be a general historical process.
Eisner's work provided hard evidence of a decline in violence. Over 8 centuries, homicide rates fell from 1 in 1,000 to 1 in 1,000,000. The big question is, why?
When you realize that rates of violence can change, that something that our ancestors did in the past worked, it emboldens you to try to figure out what it is.
One answer might be what some social theorists call the civilizing process.
The civilizing process is the idea that as societies become more interdependent, we are penalized for behaving in a violent way against another person.
In Renaissance Europe, commerce was booming. Ships brought goods from around the world. Violence among the masses was becoming bad for business and bad for the king.
If businesses want to trade, they want to make money, and people profit off that, they live better lives when the economy's going well, there's an incentive for states to prevent violence from happening.
The theory is this new economic order went hand in hand with a new set of social norms.
What changes is that as a man, your importance in society is no longer ruled by how good you are in fighting, but it's governed by how self-controlled you are.
According to some researchers, self-control was something that was sorely lacking when one considers daily life.
The medievals were, in a word, gross. They would copulate in full view. At the dinner table, they would gnaw on a bone and put it back in the serving dish, drink from the plate, smack their lips.
If you were out in public, you might very well have to relieve yourself in public view, in a street, in a bunch of holes on a bench.
And judging from these passages from popular etiquette books, things must have been pretty different.
Don't follow the staircases. Don't relieve yourself in front of ladies. Don't touch your private parts under your clothes with your bare hands. If you come across something disgusting in the sheets, don't turn to your companion and say, "I should like to know how much this stinks." Well, these are laughable rules to us now because we accept the idea that you don't go around urinating in front of other people because how you treat people matters.
But how in the world could something as mundane as manners contribute to a decline in violence?
Manners are a sign of self-control, of not acting on every impulse. If someone insults you, if someone steps on your toe, you don't immediately pull out a knife and challenge them to a fight. You hold your horses, you count to 10.
As it turns out, the connection between self-control and violence is long known to neuroscientists.
We've known for a long, long time that violent offenders have poorer levels of self-control than people who are not violent.
And that has to do with the prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain thought to be involved in planning and controlling our impulses.
We've brain scanned 41 murderers, and we showed that the prefrontal cortex is functioning more poorly in these murderers.
The red and yellow show a normal level of activity. The scans from the murderers show dramatically decreased activity. Is there anything that could be done to strengthen this part of the brain?
In today's session, you will be completing a series of survey questions.
That's what Rain's team is trying to find out here at the University of Pennsylvania.
During the stimulation itself, you'll be completing 2 cognitive tasks on the computer.
Yeah.
They get electrodes put on the prefrontal cortex, and they'll get 20 minutes of stimulation.
You may feel tingling, itching, kind of prickling sensation.
That tingling is stimulating or upregulating a specific part of the brain.
And then they're given scenarios of, if you were provoked, would you pick up a bottle? Would you hit somebody on the head? We're looking to see whether upregulating the prefrontal cortex reduces a person's intention to commit a violent criminal act. We showed that by upregulating the prefrontal cortex, we're able to reduce criminal intent by about 30 or 40%.
Is it possible, then, that acquiring habits of self-control, like manners, could have had the same effect?
By giving somebody training in exercising self-control, that activity may flex the prefrontal cortex and enhance that part of the brain.
It stands to reason that if you practice a set of behaviors, that engages areas of your brain, which leads to a sort of virtuous cycle, right? It improves the behavior, and then the behavior, if you continue to engage in it, allows you to further strengthen the circuit.
The theory is self-control laid the groundwork for a cultural shift away from violence. And yet we all know civilized is a relative term. By some measures, Europeans may have become less violent toward each other. But at the same time, they were embarking on one of the bloodiest chapters in human history, the colonial conquests.
In Europe, during these colonial regimes, there's less violence in the core of the empire. But if you think about the lives of the indigenous peoples, life was treacherous, life was awful.
The colonial project is one in which indigenous peoples are either physically and violently repressed, or in some instances, eliminated entirely.
During that same period of time that violence is going down, you have something like the transatlantic slave trade, the largest forced oceanic migration ever to occur in human history. These slave ships that are plying the Atlantic with human cargo, these are mini war zones where you have mortality levels that are between 10 and 25% on every voyage, and it lasts for nearly 400 years.
Once they arrived, many slaves were literally worked to death. In fact, much of the expansion of the European and later the US economy was built on the violent exploitation of the over 12 million people forced into the transatlantic slave trade. And slavery wasn't the only form of state-sanctioned violence.
There are a number of practices that were routine through human history that we universally recognize today are barbaric.
From infanticide as a routine form of birth control to burning at the stake, witch hunts, and human sacrifice. Across the globe, heinous practices were still rampant. And Europe was no exception.
You had gruesome punishments, sadistic forms of capital punishment like breaking on the wheel.
Breaking on the wheel is incredibly unpleasant. You were strung up on a huge wheel-like device with your various limbs attached to the wheel, and the executioner would break each one of your bones, and then you would be left to die of internal bleeding, and people would watch.
Back then, torture wasn't some random act performed by a sadistic psychopath, but a routine part of the law.
It's hard for us to imagine this, but torture was legal. It was administered in front of a judge, usually.
But by the mid-1700s, this gruesome jurisprudence was quickly losing favor in Western Europe.
How do you get from most people thinking it's perfectly fine to do unspeakable things to people to a situation in which people say, this is disgusting, it's barbaric, it's horrendous, we can't do this? And this change happens in a very short period of time.
To Lynn Hunt, a historian at UCLA, the answer has to do with a notion often taken for granted today.
Without question, the single most radical idea of the 18th century is the idea of equality. They live in an incredibly hierarchical society in which everyone is supposed to be deferential to their betters, in which there are incredibly rigid social divisions. How do they think past that?
The idea of equality, while at first reserved for a small group of people, had to come from somewhere. And Hunt thinks it started with the written word.
Literacy and the expansion of print had a very, very, very big impact.
The first mass literacy societies, where half or more of the people in the society can read, these come about in Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries, and it's driven almost entirely by people wanting to read the Bible. But as people develop this skill, they realize, well, of course I can use it for a lot more than just reading the Bible.
It wasn't just that people could read. It was what they could read about.
Newspapers got people to recognize that there was somebody else in another city who was having the same experiences as they are.
It is difficult for us living in a hyper-connected world to appreciate how big an impact this could have.
Print, newspapers are incredibly important in creating this broader sense of community.
And it wasn't just newspapers. The newly literate masses developed a huge appetite for the novel.
It allowed the reader to really get inside the mind of the characters. You don't see just what they're doing, you see what they're feeling and thinking as they're doing it.
They're writing in a way to allow the reader to enter into the life worlds of other people and get empathy that would drive them to political action.
Actions such as the abolitionist movement, which was bolstered by slave narratives and popularized by a single novel.
A book like Uncle Tom's Cabin is bringing people into a world that amplifies the humanity of the enslaved, and by extension, that they are deserving of freedom.
The theory is that reading novels made people more empathetic. But can fiction really do all that?
There's psychological evidence from laboratory studies that reading fiction can build our care even for different groups of people, groups who we might not care that much about otherwise. So for example, one of the most famous is what's known as the reading the mind in the eyes test.
The mind in the eyes, a scientific experiment designed to test empathy. Participants are shown a series of photographs of just eyes and asked to guess the emotion. Readers of literary fiction score consistently higher.
You think of reading a novel as a very personal thing that's just, oh, you're just sitting on your couch indulging in something, but no, you're doing something a lot more profound. You're kind of going to the empathy gym.
And things didn't stop with the novel. A parallel revolution in science would seed even more radical questions.
The scientific revolution drives people to ask these underlying questions about, well, why do things in the way that we do?
There was a new sense of rationality where we want to understand knowledge based on what we see and what we can actually document.
Observation, hypothesis, experiment. The modern scientific method didn't just explain the stars.
It's like scientific reasoning spills over from the natural world, the kind of thing that Galileo and Newton are interested in, toward the social world.
Rather than accepting things because that's the way they always have been, or because that's what God decreed, or because you can't criticize the king, people started to rethink social arrangements from the ground up.
It made some people think about slavery, it made some people think about women, it made some people think about religious minorities, but mainly it made everybody think about equality.
Equality. Even though it was narrowly defined to start with, 18th century European thinkers stoked the embers on a revolutionary ideal.
Once you unleash the light of freedom, we say in Africa that when the sun rises, if you don't want to see it, the only thing you can do is to close your eyes. But the rest of the world will see it. The cat is out of the bag.
Still, some ideas resulting from the scientific revolution were far from perfect.
And it's the same period in which pseudoscientific racism, as we come to know it in the second half of the 19th century, really begins.
Perhaps reason and empathy helped fuel abolitionist movements. But at the same time, science was co-opted to justify racism.
This is one of those scenarios where we have to hold two very difficult things together. Things are not always all good or all bad, but they are a complicated mixture of both.
And that balance of good and bad, according to Pinker, was shifting in favor of our angels.
The rise of science doesn't mean racism was eliminated. But it's not a coincidence that the first systematic arguments against slavery, against cruel punishment, against imperialism were made around that time. Ideas matter.
But did those ideas change people's attitudes toward physical violence? Where's the evidence? Turns out some clues were hidden in plain sight. In the records of the Old Bailey, the Central Criminal Court of London.
The Old Bailey proceedings are, in my estimation, the most detailed account of everyday life ever produced in print.
Tim Hitchcock spent 15 years digitizing 239 years of court proceedings.
They cover the period from 1674 to 1913, and they encompass 197,745 different trials. It is the largest body of recorded speech anywhere in the world.
But this giant anthology presents a giant problem.
At 197,000 trials, nobody's ever read all of them.
It's huge, right? It's unreadable.
Enter Simon DeDeo, a data scientist at Carnegie Mellon University. He has a hunch that computers can see patterns in history that no human can.
I'm interested in how people see the world. And if I want to see it really big scale over the course of a couple centuries, then I have to do a very different kind of science.
And to do that, he would need a really big data set. Hitchcock's 127 million words would do just the trick.
Somebody whispers in our ear, hey, there's this stuff sitting out there in Britain. That, for us, is a gold mine.
We met at a pub for a couple of pints of beer. And where we ended up was with a realization that there were techniques that would allow us to pull out human behavior from this 127 million words of transcribed data.
But how?
The computer can't read, it can't understand, you can't have a conversation with it. So what we have to do is transform all of those trials into something that a computer scientist can manipulate.
Here's where Tim had an idea. How about we use Roget's thesaurus?
Roget in the 19th century sat down, went through the dictionary, and assigned every word to a particular meaning.
He groups them into collections of words that all kind of mean the same thing. Words like cut and thrust, lunge, kick, punch. All of those words mean, of course, different things. It's one thing to punch somebody, it's another thing to kick somebody. What Roget's classification allows us to do is say, look, forget the details. These are all examples of category 716, attack. And that enables the computer to summarize a trial.
What quickly emerged from the analysis of the proceedings was that the words spoken in court reflect powerfully attitudes towards violence. The way in which the state defined crime and chose to prosecute crime was changing decade by decade.
For example, in the earliest accounts, the number of violent words often had nothing to do with the crime charged.
1770. John Jones and Isaac Ely of St. Sepulchre's were indicted for assaulting James Lowe upon the King's Highway. One of them immediately stabbed him with a knife on the breast, and at the same time, they catched hold of his hat and wig, value 15 shillings. Despite the violence of this assault, the eventual indictment was for theft.
But in later cases, that changes. Violent words strongly correlate with being on trial for a violent crime.
In 1909, William Musson was caught trying to steal goods and money from the commercial gas company, but in the process, he also tried to choke, suffocate, and strangle one of the guards. In this instance, the robbery itself didn't figure in the trial to any extent, and instead, what they focused on was the violence of that assault.
The records of the Old Bailey are hard evidence of a cultural shift away from interpersonal violence.
People became much less tolerant of violence. The idea that a pub fight is normal, the idea that carrying a knife or a sword was normal. By the early 20th century, people were expected to settle their disputes in ways that didn't involve breaking a nose or taking out a couple of teeth.
A decline in homicide. A retreat from heinous practices. And a cultural shift in attitudes. But these data are only for Europe. What about the rest of the world?
Can we actually draw some universal based on the European history? I would say yes and no. No, because Europe is a small backwater for all of humanity, but yes, because in the last 500 years, European philosophical, economic, and political systems have spread around the world and had massive impact.
I focus on the West because that's where the data are best. But if this is a general historical process, it has to be shown worldwide, and in many cases it has been, such as data on rates of death in warfare. That comes from all over the world.
But surely the data from the 19th and 20th centuries would paint a grim picture of the world. From the Napoleonic Wars and the Taiping Rebellion to the massive colonial conquests and 2 world wars capped by the dropping of the atomic bomb. How in the world could we be getting less violent?
World War II undoubtedly was the most destructive event in human history. But More people were alive in the 1940s than were alive in earlier periods in history. So we also have to take into account just how many people there were.
In absolute numbers, World War II may have killed the most people. But compare the death toll to the number of people living at the time, 2.3 billion. Looking at it this way, there were far deadlier events before World War II.
When you plot how many people get killed as a proportion of the world's population, you can appreciate some of these trends.
By this metric, World War II falls to number 8. The deadliest? The 13th century Mongol conquests launched by Genghis Khan, which reportedly killed roughly 40 million people, almost 10% of the world's population at the time. Of course, that's just an estimate. But there's one other number worth considering. 0. That's the number of wars waged directly between the major powers since the Korean War.
The big national armies are not fighting each other. That's not some data construction, that's a fact.
Of course, major powers have invaded smaller countries and had a hand in numerous civil wars. But overall, deaths from every form of war have been on the wane.
War is like a cancer that used to be spreading and now is in remission. It's getting smaller and smaller. The tumors are shrinking.
There are not too many periods in world history where we've observed such a steep decline in violence.
So how do we get from here to here? Is it possible that something inside us has changed?
We know that violence has been decreasing in human history, and we have a lot of explanations of why that might be, whether they be social forces or the way we think, the way we structure our society. But here we can offer a biological explanation as well.
A biological explanation that pins some of humanity's push toward peace on evolution. But to understand it, you have to look at a groundbreaking experiment in 1950s Russia.
They took a population of wild foxes and they just bred them solely for tameness. The ones that acted the friendliest, they bred those together.
By breeding the most docile foxes in each generation to each other, over the generations, they ended up with something that looked remarkably like a domesticated dog.
The fox's behavior changed. And so did their physical appearance.
The skulls became shorter and also proportionally wider.
The new shape of the skull appears to go along with decreased aggression. Over several generations, the foxes became domesticated. Is it possible that over a much longer time frame, something like this has happened to humans too? A kind of self-domestication.
The self-domestication hypothesis is, I think, one of the most exciting hypotheses running out there today.
It would mean that there was natural selection against aggressiveness, and that over the last several 100,000 years, our species has become less violent, and conceivably that is still continuing today.
To test this hypothesis, Robert Sierra gathered up human skulls from across 200,000 years. Like the foxes, has the shape of our skulls changed?
This particular specimen is about 90,000 years old, and I'm measuring the width, or the length of the face, and then I'm also going to measure the projection of the brow ridge.
These skull measurements are tightly linked to levels of a hormone known to facilitate violence: testosterone.
In general, people with higher testosterone have different face shapes than people that have lower testosterone.
To some, this harkens back to 19th century pseudoscience.
Phrenology was a pseudoscientific practice where they would look at the shape of someone's skull and infer things about their personality. But this isn't phrenology. the trends we're showing line up with a lot of other forms of evidence.
And it's more than the shape of the face.
Testosterone is a very complicated hormone, but we do know that it seems to be correlated with levels of aggression and violence.
It's not like, you give somebody more testosterone and they turn into the Incredible Hulk and start tearing things apart. But men who've been exposed to higher levels of testosterone during prenatal development or during pubertal development are more likely to engage in aggression throughout the lifespan.
This link may partly explain why it is men who are responsible for most of the world's violence.
90-something% of every kind of violence you can think of is due to males. If we somehow got rid of human males, then the entire situation would change.
In fact, the situation may have already changed. And the evidence might be staring us in the face.
We found that the shape of the skulls changed. The upper face became shorter relative to its width, and the brow ridge projection went down over time. So we're showing that testosterone levels have gone down over the last 200,000 years.
The anatomical evidence is very clear. Our males became much less aggressive.
Violence was an important social tool in human history. You can get things done by being violent. But we're moving into a world where that tool is less and less effective, and violence doesn't pay off as much.
And the recent rise of nonviolent movements seems to bear this out. Consider Mahatma Gandhi, who showed the world the power of nonviolent resistance.
The Salt March of 1930, where he drew in hundreds of thousands of Indians by marching 200+ miles to the sea, had a profound effect on people's understanding of what nonviolent action could achieve.
And Erica Chenoweth's research suggests Gandhi was by no means alone. The Salt March is now just one of over 300 cases of nonviolent resistance that occurred since 1900.
The Philippines People Power Movement, the Polish Solidarity Movement, the Serbian anti-Milosevic movement, the Rose Revolution in Georgia, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the Tunisian Jasmine Revolution.
But the most impressive thing is not the sheer number, it's their results.
Nonviolent action has been wildly more effective. In fact, the success rates of nonviolent mass movements are about twice as large as the success rates for violent campaigns.
And this increase in nonviolent resistance has been paralleled with an expansion of human rights. The adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, though just words on paper, set a new goal for the world.
The idea of universal human rights is a huge change in worldview. It meant that you couldn't enslave other people. It meant you couldn't wage wars that devastated people by the millions.
The rights revolution that sputtered forward in the 19th century was finally gaining momentum.
This is the thing about rights. The minute you declare their existence, you get people saying, well, if that, why not this? You instantly have this kind of pressure for the recognition of more rights, which we still are living with today.
And where there's reliable data, this expansion in rights often maps onto downturns in many quantifiable measures of physical violence. Genocide, homicide, rape, assault, child abuse, domestic violence, even spanking. They all point downward. But before we pat ourselves on the back, it's worth considering that these numbers only tally physical violence.
Steven Pinker's focus on deadly violence is telling us part of the picture. It's an important question to ask, but it's not comprehensive, right, in the kinds of violence that affect people's daily lives.
Lethality isn't the only way to measure violence. mass incarceration is a form of violence. There's a kind of psychological violence, right? The destruction of other people's wills that is happening on a mass scale that doesn't get counted in those statistics.
The definition of violence has to be expanded. What does it mean to live longer if you're suffering horribly, mentally, socially, cognitively? And so how we think about ups and downs in violence has to take this broader perspective.
We're at the point in which discussions of violence are evolving, and that is real progress from when discussions of violence were centered on world wars, genocides.
Nonetheless, even if progress is being made, a trend is not necessarily a prediction.
With the enormous military capacities that states have today, it takes just one war to destroy the whole trend.
And just as German nationalism spawned Hitler, many see today's new wave of nationalism as a looming threat.
In many countries, we've seen maybe a little bit of a backsliding towards more authoritarianism.
Voters who are motivated by nationalism may elect leaders that could destroy it all.
And blindly following those leaders wherever they may lead us is still a very real danger. At SWPS University in Poland, Tomasz Grzyb and Dariusz Doliński are revisiting a famous experiment first conducted in the 1960s by the American psychologist Stanley Milgram. In the aftermath of the Holocaust, Milgram wanted to understand how seemingly good people could follow terrible orders. Just as Milgram did, the experiment starts by setting up a fake study.
There are two participants, and there is a guy who presents himself as a professor of psychology, and he says that, well, you are a participant in an experiment which is devoted to find out how memory is working.
Grzyb is masquerading as a participant, the so-called learner.
Pana zadaniem jest wyuczenie się takich skojarzeń. Jeśli usłyszy pan DA, to ma pan odpowiedzieć DE. Natomiast jeśli zdarzy się panu popełnić błąd, będzie pan karany, ponieważ sprawdzamy...
The other participant is the teacher.
Ja poproszę panią, pani wylosowała rolę nauczyciela, żeby pani sobie tutaj usiadła, ja za chwilę do pani wrócę, a z panem pójdziemy do pomieszczenia obok, gdzie będzie się pan tego uczył.
Grzyb pretends to memorize sets of letters, but his responses are scripted.
Pani rolą jest bycie nauczycielem w tym eksperymencie. Jeśli przeczyta pani BA, to należy oczekiwać odpowiedzi BO. Ale jeśli zdarzy się, być może, że ten pan się pomyli, to wtedy będziemy używać tego urządzenia. To jest generator prądu elektrycznego, który po prostu pozwala nam wysyłać kary. Te pierwsze przyciski emitują bardzo słabe uderzenie, potem takie średnie, mocne, bardzo mocne. Tutaj są już intensywne, ekstremalnie intensywne. Tu
The teacher is told that the student is hooked up to the machine, and they must administer a shock if he answers incorrectly.
Ten pan jest tam, tak?
Ten pan jest tak, tam za ścianą właśnie. Czy pan nas słyszy?
Tak, słyszę dobrze.
Doskonale, wobec tego będziemy zaczynać. Proszę. Czytamy pierwszą sylabę.
Ba.
BO.
OF.
OF to AN.
LA.
DA.
Błąd. Proszę wcisnąć pierwszy przycisk.
Na długo? Tak?
Nie, to tylko malusieńki, króciutki impuls. I ósma para.
GA.
DE.
Błąd. Proszę wcisnąć drugi przycisk. I teraz 11.
Grzyb is only acting. He is not really wired to the machine.
Proszę kontynuować.
Because the experiment is highly stressful for the real subject, the so-called teacher, it's controversial. So it will be stopped at 150 volts, the 10th switch on the panel, which, if real, would be an extremely painful shock. Will anyone go so high?
Eksperyment wymaga, aby pan kontynuował. Proszę wcisnąć trzeci przycisk. Błąd. Proszę wcisnąć czwarty przycisk. Proszę wcisnąć piąty przycisk. Proszę wcisnąć szósty przycisk. Ósmy przycisk. Proszę wcisnąć ósmy przycisk. Dziewiąty przycisk. Błąd. Błąd. Nie ma pan wyboru. Proszę wcisnąć 10. przycisk. Myśli pani, że go boli?
With an authority figure ordering them, most people go all the way to the highest shock level.
We had about 220 participants, and about 90% of them were able to go up to the 10th switch.
Many people think they wouldn't follow orders to commit violence. But the work of Grzyb and Dolinsky suggests this capacity is in most of us.
It's not a question of our personality, it's a question of situation. There is a high probability that each one of us would behave in the same way. Somehow, by our internal construction, by our attitude to the world, we are ready to do bad things to other people.
Hate no longer hides behind hoods.
Which lands us in the present. It's clear that the story of human violence is not simple. Peace is not a foregone conclusion.
Reminiscent of images from a dark American past.
We can go backward again. Just as we move very quickly toward a peaceful world, we can move very quickly back toward a world where most of us think violence is the answer.
President's extraordinary tweet raised the real possibility the U.S. and Russia could soon be shooting at each other.
Peace is being treated as something that automatically comes to pass, and we really can't take it for granted.
In the U.S., violent clashes broke out on Saturday in the city of Portland, Oregon.
Our nasty impulses haven't gone away.
Gallery this afternoon.
To point out that things were worse in the past is not to say that things are perfect in the present.
Because we still don't know just how many gunmen are out there and when they will be found.
Quite the contrary. It's precisely by understanding how our predecessors were able to drive down rates of violence that we can be emboldened to try to drive them down even further.
And to do that requires stepping back and trying to understand why the world feels so violent in the first place.
We are in a supersaturated 24/7 information society. When it bleeds, it leads. And there is a sense, probably accelerated by both conventional media but also social media, that things are spinning out of control.
Reynolds streamed what happened next live on Facebook.
He was reaching for his wallet, and the officer just shot him in his arm.
People are experiencing violence happening in other places all over the world right now in their own lives in a way they just couldn't before. That is a sea change in our consciousness.
All this information feeds a particular bias long known to neuroscientists and psychologists.
We call it the availability heuristic. We judge risk and danger according to how quickly examples pop into mind.
The van raced along at close to 50 miles.
So if there's a terrorist attack in the news, we think that terrorism is skyrocketing upward.
But if you look at the actual risk of being a victim of a terrorist incident in, say, Western Europe or North America, it's less than being hit by lightning.
North Korea's nuclear test.
A diet of news stories will fool us into thinking that violence is much more prevalent than it really is.
Ever closer to a deliverable nuclear warhead.
I have that same reaction. There has to be danger. And to let your guard down for a moment is to be a sap, is to make yourself vulnerable. And it's only my scientific training that allows me to say, you know what, crazy brain, look at the data.
But aggregate data can only tell you so much. For example, taking the U.S. as a whole, homicide rates have declined dramatically to about 5 deaths per 100,000 people per year. But when you drill down, you find that some cities have rates up to 10 times higher.
We tend to think of this phenomena as affecting all people equally, but the reality when it comes to, say, homicide or terrorism is that it's hyper-concentrated in time, space, and amongst certain communities.
Why are some places more violent than others? What can the past tell us about violence today? History suggests that some of the factors driving violence down are a strong government, education, and equality. But those conditions are not evenly distributed today.
Income inequality has a very strong statistical relationship with overall levels of homicide.
In fact, income inequality is one of the strongest predictors for violence. Here in Baltimore, the situation is particularly dire, fueled in part by a legacy of racism and an extreme lack of economic mobility.
I don't think that people are getting up every morning and saying, who am I going to go shoot today? I think people are getting up saying, how am I going to eat today? And if someone prevents them from doing what they think they have to do in order to feed themselves and their families, there's a ripe opportunity for violence.
Baltimore City has seen 250 murders so far this year.
Once violence starts, it spread.
You can see the gun in his left hand.
The gunman is still on the loose here in Baltimore.
When you kill this person, brother, then they want to retaliate and they want to make somebody feel the pain that they felt. So they become shooters and killers. It's like a demon. It's spread from souls to souls.
Without the resources to fix the underlying problems, this neighborhood is turning to an innovative intervention to reduce violence.
With respect to violence, we're stuck in the past. Our thinking now is medieval. We're blaming people, not understanding what's going on, actually not applying approaches that have been shown to work.
For epidemiologist Gary Slutkin, those approaches are based on data. After returning from over a decade fighting infectious diseases in Africa, he recognized a distinct pattern.
I'm looking at a graph of violence that looks exactly like the graph of cholera. I'm looking at the map of the clustering of violence. It looks exactly like the mapping of AIDS. So I'm like saying, oh my God, you know, this is exactly like every infectious disease.
And just like a disease, under certain conditions, violent acts are contagious.
One case of violence causes more cases of violence, just as one case of flu causes more cases of flu.
So could the same methods used to fight infectious diseases also stop shootings?
The shootings that we have had, most of them ease to us inside here.
That's an idea being tested at Baltimore's Safe Streets, one of a growing number of programs adopting Slutkin's approach.
It's just a lot of shootings going on in the neighborhood, so we was really trying to get to the bottom of that.
The starting point in any epidemic is to detect where the next event might occur and interrupt the exposure.
So what we gonna do today for canvassing?
I mean, there's been a lot of things going on in the neighborhood, so I'm gonna just take a tour.
To do that, Slutkin created a new type of public health worker, a violence interrupter.
A violence interrupter is basically a health worker who can know what is going on and find where an event might be likely to happen and then prevent its progression. So you're cutting off the epidemic spread itself.
The first step in fighting any epidemic is to identify the initial outbreaks, the so-called hotspots.
The red dots are the firearm homicides and the yellow dots are the non-fatal shootings.
So if we map out all of the violence in the area, then we can sort of see like, oh, there's a cluster up here on the right where the stat should be focusing on. Maybe down here on the left, there's another little area that we tend to see more violence happening. And then we base our program decisions on that data.
Once the hotspots are pinpointed, the violence interrupters are deployed.
Lately, there's been a lot of activity in the community, so we just coming through, try to make sure everything at peace.
This team works in Park Heights, one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in the city.
Most of the violence is spontaneous, so we just try to do our walk so we can be there to try to catch it. What really make the program is the guys that's out here doing the footwork, doing the groundwork, because it's our credibility that really keep the peace.
We just try to get in everybody's ears and everybody's mind and let them know the shootings and homicides are not normal. It's not normal for somebody to lay right there with 5 and 6 bullet holes in him and he's dying, and it ain't normal for kids to see. It ain't normal for a mother to lose her son to senseless violence like that.
Steve Diggs, better known as Pepe, knows these streets.
I'm born and bred Park Heights. I've been here my entire life. If you drop me in the ocean in the middle of the night, I'll start swimming towards Park Heights.
And he knows all about the violence.
I fell in love with the streets. The whole lifestyle of it. Girls, money, the respect that you get in the neighborhood, you know, all the way down to the part where I had to bust somebody in their head. Disrespecting me could get a person beat nearly to death. Has gotten people beat nearly to death. I had to sit in jail for 10 months because I beat a guy nearly to death. I was that person for 30 years. I had to let that person die and create this person right here. That's what qualifies all of us to do this. You walk the walk, you talk the talk. You qualified to intervene. She told me that she was going to the police station and fill out a report on you.
For what? I didn't do anything to her.
Today, Pepe is following up on a violent altercation.
I couldn't understand how I got that
Look at
far
my
in the first
face.
place.
She beat me in my face, kicked me in my back. I felt a threat. She's yelling, belligerent.
We're gonna do it one at a time, okay?
You went to me like this. No, Yes, you did, and then that's when I blacked out on you. You was pummeling me.
All right.
Because you're trying to grab stuff. I don't know what you're doing. I'm grabbing my phone. See how you doing?
Right now, y'all not listening to each other.
I know, but
You're not hearing nothing she said because you so ready to talk back. Maybe it's something else.
I would have to leave. I don't have a problem. Regardless, I'm going to leave because I feel out of place.
Even though I knew they wasn't listening to each other. I think it was very helpful because they feel like they vindicated. For them to be able to do that on their own, they wouldn't have been able to do it because it would have just went on and on and on until one of them threw a punch. Women fight way differently from men. Guys, they run for their knife or their gun, which is so sad.
Later, Pepe is dispatched to defuse a potentially deadly dispute.
Unfortunately, we live by the gun around here, man.
The man Pepe is talking to says that 2 nights ago, he ordered a revenge killing. But his guys shot at the wrong person, and now that person wants to take revenge.
Let me see your hands, yo.
You see my...
Let me see your hands, yo.
You come around here for no smoke. You didn't come around here for no smoke, right?
Hands,
you didn't come around here for no smoke, right? Right? Listen, for no smoke. Tell them what you just told me, yo.
Let me see your hands, yo.
Let me see your hands. Keep your hands out your pocket. You're making me nervous, yo.
Wait for this dude here, man. I'm gonna tell you something, man. We're gonna go a lot different than this, right?
And I know that. I know who you is.
I know who you is. Because I'm not with none of this
right here. That's how you know it's not gonna happen again, right?
Man, you if it's the same thing, though. You right, I would get the same thing. I would get the same.
All right, okay. Now we got common ground. We got common ground. You with her? Can we agree that you apologize, yo?
Absolutely.
I'm gonna accept that, man. But I'm gonna tell you this, man. You don't come back from that death. It ain't no coming back from that.
Yeah, don't shake his hand. I say don't shake his hand. I mean, like, watch it, yo. We all
man. I'm gonna just leave this be, man.
Facts, yo. Facts.
It's a hell of a mistake to make. We are guys right directly in these neighborhoods that can bring these two guys together in the midst of their anger, their hatred, and their want for revenge, and bring about a peaceful resolution. That's a big part of what Safe Streets do.
A lot of times, guys want to put an end to the conflict, especially when them guns get to going. The Safe Street guys give him a way to get out of there. All right, Safe Street squad. So now I'm not looking like a punk. Now I'm not looking like I'm scared of nothing. But it's not just about that. People out here really need resources. Not justifying nothing, but a lot of people be surprised what people be going through.
All right, okay, so what's the next part? What you gotta do? What you gotta do to get yourself right, though? Stop all this up.
I need drugs. I'm only trying to get a job. That's it. I swear it's so hard for me. I'm trying.
Because you know what? We gotta deal with one thing at a time. You know what I'm saying? We gotta deal with the big issue.
It ain't funny, yo.
A lot of violence come from lack of. That's a lack of education. That's a lack of food. That's a lack of basic necessities like clothes, water.
When we interrupt the violence and we take a look at what the precipitating factors are that contributed to the violence, we see opportunity to connect folk to additional services of support. And those services could range anywhere from mental health, substance abuse, housing, transportation, things that help people get on their feet so that they don't have to rely on the streets to feed themselves and their families.
While Safe Streets connects people to a host of community services, they're not designed to take on the root causes of violence. Their success is measured in two key metrics: shootings and killings. While surrounding neighborhoods continue to see high levels of firearm homicide, from 2017 to 2018, the Park Heights post went 382 days without a single killing. And people are starting to take notice. Over 50 sites around the world have adopted the approach practiced by Cure Violence. And the data is clear. It's working.
Because they come from the public health field, they set a very high bar for evidence.
Cure Violence has been evaluated for its work in Chicago, in Baltimore, in New York, in Honduras, in Mexico, in New Orleans, in South Africa. And repeatedly, the findings are that shootings and killings go down by between 40 and 70%. And it's sustained. Behaviors that were formed years ago can be completely changed.
That right there. I am a case in point. Violence can be unlearned. Sometimes I hardly believe that I found a job, an employment that I love, that it's actually noticed that people like me stop so much more violence from happening.
Focused programs on crime reduction have shown they can work. Even if you haven't cured blights like inequality and poverty and racism, you can prevent an awful lot of people from getting killed.
Data can be a useful tool in tackling violence, but it is by no means enough. Knowledge is power, only if you act on it. Consider mass shootings.
Gun violence is still a big challenge in the United States. And yet, funding to do research on this public health challenge was taken away by the CDC because of, let's call it, disagreements in Congress.
But the research that is available points towards solutions.
It may seem impossible to talk about preventing and reducing gun violence in America today, but the fact is there are examples of where smart interventions have generated declines in gun violence.
Take the example of Australia. Following a mass shooting in April 1996 that took 35 lives, reaction was swift.
The Prime Minister John Howard tonight detailed sweeping plans to reform Australia's national gun laws. Prime Minister John Howard.
Instead of having an agonizing debate that went nowhere about what to do about it, what you had was action.
To achieve a total prohibition on the ownership of all automatic and semi-automatic weapons.
Within months, the Parliament in Australia had legislated that there ought to be a massive gun collection program and new constraints and controls and regulations around certain types of weapons.
Assault weapons were banned, and over 650,000 were turned into the government. Gun-related homicides plummeted.
When Australia passed a stringent gun control measure, rampage killings, which had afflicted the country, fell pretty much to zero.
In the 23 years after the ban, Australia had only 2 mass shootings with a total of 10 dead. The message is that gun regulations can reduce deaths. And that would appear to be true here in the US. In the aftermath of the Sandy Hook shootings, Connecticut passed some of the nation's most restrictive gun laws. Since then, the 5-year average of gun-related homicides has dropped by 1/3. And it's not just Connecticut.
States across the United States that have had tighter, more restrictive legislation, especially around carrying of firearms, tend to show lower rates of homicide, lower rates of intimate partner violence, lower rates of suicide.
With the help of data, even the most intractable problems can become a little less daunting.
There's some parts of the world that people tend to write off as just hotbeds of war and where there's nothing you can do about it.
Take the recent genocides in Rwanda, Sudan, and Myanmar. Though in each case the root causes of violence are complex, one thing they share is long-standing ethnic and religious tensions. Among the most challenging, the Middle East, where the wars in Syria and Iraq have displaced millions and brought chilling stories to the evening news.
The Syrian regime just attacked its own people with chemical weapons again, a war crime.
It is easy to be pessimistic about the Middle East. The conflict is very raw, the distrust is very deeply ingrained. So if we can find even small effects in this setting, it suggests that elsewhere, we might find bigger effects.
Can science do anything to reduce those underlying tensions? Mass in a church in the village of Karakosh in the Nineveh plains of northern Iraq. There are an estimated 400,000 Christians in Iraq. About 50,000 of them once lived in this predominantly Christian enclave. The community and the church bear the scars of a bloody uprising. In 2014, ISIS militants swept through the Nineveh plains. Rami Hanna is one of thousands that fled Karakosh as ISIS approached.
تهجرنا كلتنا تاريخ 6/8/2014 فاتوا دواعش على مناطق سهل نينا وكلها. طائفية كانت مشتغلة بالعراق حقيقة كان قتل على الهوية.
Rami's mother thought they would only be gone for a few days.
والله شلنا رحنا اليوم تنرجع وباكر نرجع اليوم نرجع وباكر ماكو رجعة. قعدنا قبل ما هي بس أنا إيش كنت أعمل؟ أمي مريم بس أرجع على البيت. أمي مريم بس على البيت بس عاونينا أمي مريم بس تعاونينا أمي مريم قربان اسمك بس تعاونينا نرجع على البيت.
In fact, it was 2 years before the city was liberated. Rami's family returned to find their home looted and damaged beyond recognition. They were one of the lucky families. About a third of the homes had been set on fire. And occupying jihadists had tried to erase any evidence of Christianity from Karakosh. Burning churches, destroying statues, toppling towers.
What ISIS did to the religious minorities in the Nineveh Plains region is classified now as a genocide or as ethnic cleansing by the State Department, by the UN. These were communities targeted specifically because of their religious or ethnic background. There were kidnappings, killings, sex slaves. The armed forces just fled. So it really was a horrific experience.
Little by little, more residents have been returning to Karakosh. Among them, Mohammed Hussein. Today he prays at his mosque, thankful for the omnipresent security forces.
يوم عن يوم يتحسن يعني موجود كل القوات الأمنية من الحشد من كل الفئات يعني وموجود حراسات يعني قرقوش هم.
Nonetheless, religious tensions still remain high.
In the wake of a conflict like this, the social trust just becomes obliterated. So you have neighbors that become suspicious of other neighbors. People are perceived as being collaborators on the basis of what community they belong to.
بعد الأحداث اللي صارت مع داعش يعني ممكن أكو الفكر الداعشي مزروع ببعض العلم. احنا مع احترامنا لاخواننا الاسلام بالموصل ونحبهم ونقدرهم ودائما يبقون بقلبنا لان احنا عشنا وياهم فتره مو قليله، بس الشيء اللي صار قمنا نخاف من عنده حقيقه يعني.
ISIS may be gone, but two powerful ingredients for violence, prejudice and sectarian hostility, remain.
Ethnic cleansing doesn't just happen overnight. The first step of that is like some level of prejudice toward another group. It turns into dehumanization of the other group. And that just escalates where you come to a point where people actually feel justified inflicting harm on a group.
Looking at what happened in Karakosh, it is difficult to imagine what could heal these wounds. One solution may lie in a rather unexpected place.
Soccer is something people do just for fun. We just add some tweaks in terms of how to mix up the team composition to test the idea of contact.
Political scientist Salma Musa traveled to Iraq to test an idea. Could something as simple as playing a game reduce prejudice and increase empathy? It's kickoff in the Nineveh Plains Soccer League. Rami, a Christian, captains his team.
أخذت 9 من 10 بالاختبار أنا وريان تواماتي أخويا، فأنا أيضا من اللاعبين الجيدين المتميزين بدون ما أدعم نفسي، يعني جمهوري يعرفون هذا الشيء. فدوري شباب سهل نينا.
Trying to stop him scoring in the opposition's goal is Muhammad, a Muslim.
هو يعني كانت طفولة حراسة في اسمه حارس فريق الشرطة لأن أفضل حارس.
They come from different worlds, and neither has any idea that they are taking part in an experiment, testing contact theory.
The contact hypothesis. It's the idea that when we have a lack of empathy for others who are different from us, or feel prejudice against them, it's really because we don't know them very well. And if we were to merely come into contact with those outsiders, it would stop feeling as much like an us and them situation.
The theory suggests that contact would only work to increase empathy under certain conditions, when the groups are on equal footing, sharing a common goal.
The idea behind contact theory is that contact can reduce prejudice. This idea has been around for a long time, but what is new is we now have the scientific methods and the rigor to try to test some of these things.
Musa created a new soccer league and invited teams around Karakosh to join. Rabia Zakaria is the league's organizer. He signed up 37 teams with 444 players.
The teams in this area tend to be homogenous. So there are Christian teams, there are Muslim teams, there are Kurdish teams. Once they signed up for the league, we'd said, well, social inclusion is part of our mandate, and so we need to mix up some of the teams, so all of the teams are going to get some added players.
حقيقة احنا قليل ونادرا ان ما يلعبون ويانا اخواننا الاسلام بالفرق. هذا الشيء اول مرة يصير بانه فريق مسيحي يفوت ويا اخوان اسلام معنا.
On Rami's team, he plays alongside 3 Muslim players. And Mohammed is one of 3 Muslims on his team. Musa kept some of the teams all Christian as a control. Would being on a mixed team do anything to change attitudes?
When we asked other people to join them, players, it was kind of difficult at the beginning because some of the players felt not welcome in the team. But we asked them to train, and it got better.
Gradually, the players started working together on the field. But off the field, Musa needed a way to test if her experiment was making a difference. To do that, first she had Rabia arrange a social event. Would players from both communities turn up?
The real moment where I thought there might be something to this was when I saw that the players who were on mixed teams were double as likely as those on the control teams to show up for this social event.
But that was an event arranged by the study. What about on their own? To find out, Musa had Rabia give the players vouchers to unfamiliar restaurants. Normally, people in this region don't go to restaurants owned by members of another faith. Periodically, Rabia collects the vouchers from the restaurants.
So we have almost more than 200.
Each voucher is tagged with a specific ID number, and the restaurant owners help track if people came alone or with others.
مثل فريقي كانوا وياي أصدقائي ورحنا يعني.
ليش ما أروح لك عليه وأنا أحضنه؟ أنا ما أشوف هذا يخصمنا.
The results showed a marked shift in behavior.
Being on a mixed team makes you more likely to go to a social event where people from the other group are present. It makes you more likely to go to different neighborhoods or different cities even that are dominated by another group.
And though the changes were modest, her survey showed a shift in belief that coexistence is possible.
Playing on a team with diverse teammates makes you more likely to say that it's important to treat each other as Iraqis first as opposed to other community identities.
كلتنا عراقيين ما فرقنا بين طائفة أو قومية معتقدة، ولكن الأهم الشيء اللي جمعنا هي المحبة.
لا موجودة الانتصالات وأكثر الكوفيات، يعني نقعد ويا أصدقائنا المسيحيين ونطلع ونرجع، يعني حتى بالأعياد عندي يعني أكثر أصدقائي ويانا وياهم بالأعياد، يعني نطلع سوا.
But tensions are high once again in Karakosh. The final in the Nineveh League has ended in a draw, and the tie must be decided on penalty kicks. Rame steps up to the spot and scores.
I was watching on Facebook Live when we had our end of league celebration and we were handing out the trophies, and I saw Romy get his like massive trophy. And he gave a little speech. Part of his speech was, there are really like no boundaries when we play soccer, and it doesn't matter where you're from or who you are, we're here to do the same thing.
هي أي شيء للرياضة يعني لكل القوميات تتغير كل شيء، يعني ما يظل لا شغلة طائفية ولا شغلة قومية بالكرة القدم. يعني من تجي تلعب البطولة أو تشترك ببطولة أنت من تجي تجمع من كل الأديان.
I'd like to think that soccer can save the world. I know it's not that simple. But if we find even some small effects on people's behaviors, considering that we're dealing in a very difficult environment, I think that's very promising. And I hope that we can use some of these insights to prevent violence on the basis of someone's identity.
Though small steps like these may give people hope, it's important to keep such results in perspective.
I don't think there's anything wrong in recognizing that there's progress. We just want to be sure that patting ourselves on the back for that doesn't obscure what else still needs to be done.
Human beings, we are so complex. But our understanding of ourselves as a species, that understanding evolves.
Even if we're a long way from a world free of violence, it's still possible to be inspired by how far our species has come.
As you become aware of the historical decline of violence, the world starts to look different. You start to appreciate things that we can take for granted.
How major conflicts in the news have not escalated to world war.
Threatened by rival India.
How new monuments are named for martyrs and civil rights leaders, not war heroes. How the quest for human rights is crossing international borders. Our past has led us down this path. The question is, will we stay on it?
We're in a unique moment today in which we have a chance to sort of lock in some of this progress that humanity has made.
We should never take for granted that when we're enjoying a period of peace, it's because it's inevitable. We have to continually work for peace.
Until recently, we lived in a world in which slavery and rape and warfare were the norm, not the exception. What's changed over history is the better angels of our nature predominate over our inner demons.
We can see the shootings go down.
We've done something right. Let's figure out what it is and make sure we keep doing it.
Humans are a hot mess, and we have so much more to do. One of the benefits of Pinker's work is to remind ourselves of all that needs to be done.